than individuals working alone? I'll put that question to our panel of experts.
I tried to get the artist to put as much excitement as possible in a drawing. If somebody in a story was frightened, I didn't want somebody to look like this. I want them to look like this. You know? And and on and on. And if somebody threw a punch, it wasn't that. It was that.
Now, class, as you can see, this is terrible comic book layout. Our hero's body has completely left the borders of the panel. The artist must capture this dramatic action and graphically show the reader what is happening. And so the topic of today's lecture will be page layout and the art of comic book narration. My cyber assistant Nancy from the audiovisual department will now show a series of comic book panels that successfully communicate a story. Nancy?
Rising anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe has voted English-only sign. 40,000 tons of foreign with PCBs blew up the ozone layer today.
Standing by for solid rocket booster separation.
Greetings, prisoners of gravity. This is Commander Rick, the Comics Comic. The very first comic book ever published was Funnies on Parade, produced in 1933 by collecting cartoon strips from daily newspapers and just pasting them row upon row onto pages. By 1935, New Comics was featuring 80 pages of original stories and original characters created specifically for the comic book form. But it was still laid out like a collection of daily strips. In fact, comics followed that format until the 40s, when a couple of geniuses from New York City revolutionized comics. Jack Kirby introduced larger-than-life characters that leapt off the page right into readers' faces. Compare some early Superman artwork with Kirby's superheroes. His big, brawny, brawling brutes explode outwards, punching the panels apart and tumbling pell-mell down the pages. Kirby's dynamic art style still echoes through every superhero comic sold today. And then came Will Eisner with The Spirit. Eisner's weekly 7-page comic feature pioneered atmospheric panel design, unusual perspectives, and dramatic lighting. His carefully controlled page layout created a timing and a tempo for the stories, and it heightened the film noir mood of this dapper detective's elegant adventures. Later, in his book, Comics and Sequential Art, Eisner shared his techniques, trade secrets, and artistic philosophy. Back in the 40s, when you were working on The Spirit, how important was layout to you?
Depends on what you mean by layout. There are two definitions to layout. There is the cartoonist who approaches the page from the look of excitement of the page. So when you open the page, there's a lot of excitement, and very often people will arrange balloons and elements on a page for nothing more than for the excitement or the look of it, the total look of it. My arrangements took a different approach. I was constantly concerned with the story itself. The number of panels never mattered to me. What was important was the rhythm of the story. I write, to this day, I write with a sort of a metronome in my head. I write in a kind of rhythm, both in balloon and with the artwork. And I write with images. When I sit down and write a story, I don't write it out on a typewriter to begin with. I write it out along with images and words. So the layout of the page, or the arrangement of the images on the page, were always in service to the story and the rhythm of the story.
Okay, well then why did you start using full-page images at the beginning of each Spirit story when the rhythm of the other pages was based on a number of much smaller panels?
As always, I was always in a state of experimentation, and so I began to realize that I had available to me something that I hadn't really understood as a device before, and that is the opening of the story, which could lead the reader into the story and set the scene. So gradually I began to use that first page both as a design device, that is a packaging device, and also what I could put in italics as a mood setter or an introduction to the story. It's like, I guess it could be compared to the days when you were a kid sitting in camp and saying, well, I'm going to tell a ghost story. Turned out the lights and lowered your voice and set the mood, and so when you finally told the ghost story, everybody was prepared for it.
Mike, I know you got your big break in comics when you apprenticed for Will Eisner in the 60s, but how big an influence did he have on you artistically?
Will was an enormous influence. I mean, one, the fact that he felt I could draw, and I thought, oh, this guy's a genius, and he's the world's greatest storyteller. And he was an enormous influence on me, and he knows it. Because I think he wants me to pay for it. I expect a bill in the mail any day now. No, Will is wonderful. Love him.
In comics and sequential art, Will compares comics to film in terms of how the tale is told. Given your work as a storyboard artist on dozens of films, I take it you'd agree with him.
Film and comic storytelling have a great deal in common, I feel, because you are editing, you're taking out a panel because you're thinking to yourself, hey, listen, I can combine this panel with this panel, and I can make the page more attractive by telling two stories, one in the picture and one in the words. And so I do a lot of editing, much like in film when I do books.
The comic artist is more than just an editor. He or she controls the lighting, camera angles, set design, props and costumes, special effects, casting, makeup, and even directing. A key figure in developing the cinematic style of comic art in the 60s was Joe Kubert with Enemy Ace. In this World War I action series, Kubert used continuous backgrounds, fluid panel design, and bold page layout to draw readers into the thick of the dogfights, while cinematic techniques like zooming in, panning, and cutting from close-ups to long shots allowed the aerial combat to soar seamlessly from page to page. If Will Eisner introduced cinematic techniques to comics, Joe Kubert was widescreen Panavision. A while back, I asked Joe about the importance of page layout.
The design of the page, I think, helps stimulate the eye, the person who's reading the material, helps pull them into the page, but that's only a part of it. The most important aspect, as far as I'm concerned, is the actual storytelling. Is the story clear? Is it capable? Is it able for the person who is reading the story to follow the sequences smoothly enough so that they are not even aware that they are reading still pictures? They get the... if somebody says to me, Joe, I love your artwork. The artwork on this story looked terrific. I am not complimented by that. I would much prefer they said, I like that story, because then I know that the artwork was so integrated into the story that they didn't even realize that they were looking at pictures. Then I feel that I've accomplished what I've set out to do.
Right. Now, when you're working on a specific panel of art, how do you decide which tool to use, a pen or a brush or a marker?
When I'm rendering, when I'm finishing the rendering of an illustration, I will use any number of tools. I use perhaps a half dozen pens, perhaps 3 or 4 brushes, and I will use that particular tool that gets the best effect for me. What do I mean by best effect? Well, if I had to, and if I felt that the effect I was looking for could be created by dipping the back end of the brush in, I would do it that way. That's the way I approach an illustration. To me, it's like building something. To do a drawing is like taking different elements and building an entity. Sometimes I have to take away stuff. Many times I put more into the drawing than I mean to. And very often I find at the end of the illustration, I want to take out half the stuff that I put in, and I often do. So it is kind of building, putting pieces together until it gets to a point where I say, hold it, stop. This is it. That works for me. I believe that most artists should be born with a little imp on their shoulder. And after a time when the artist is working, that little imp comes out, grabs him by the hands, and says, stop. You've just finished that. Don't do any more. You've just finished that drawing. And that's the way I would approach it.
You can learn Joe's approach by attending his comic book school in New Jersey. Nancy, punch up the phone number. Joe offers a 4-year course in comic creation, and the alumni includes illustrious illustrators like Steve Bissett, the editor of Taboo, and Rick Veitch of Swamp Thing fame. One book that's on the required reading list for any serious student of the medium is Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. Scott traces the history of graphic storytelling back to the 11th century and the Bayeux Tapestry, a pictorial history of the Norman invasion of England. Understanding Comics uses the comic book format to explore the range of styles that artists are using today and to offer a profound philosophical treatise on the art of graphic storytelling. The medium is the message. How important is the composition of the comic book page?
It's tremendously important. Composition in comics is really the soul of what comics is all about. How do you arrange the elements on a page? How do you arrange panel after panel? How do you arrange what's in the panel? In fact, in some ways, one philosophy of comics is that comics is just a series of decisions. And all the rules are off when it comes to traditional composition. A perfect composition in traditional picture making is not necessarily good in comics. In comics, it has to have a dynamic, changing quality to it. Very often the composition of a page, because time is introduced as an element, is actually not a perfect composition in the traditional sense. It can be very unbalanced. It can have a sort of kinetic quality that when you start to look at it, you find yourself spilling down the page and into the next one. It's to keep the eye moving, and as such, it doesn't obey the traditional rules. You've got to take into account the composition of change and the composition of memory and other considerations which don't exist in single pictures.
So then how important is the space between the panels?
Well, in my book, I essentially say that, to me, that's the heart of comics. The contents of the panels are important. Writing and drawing is important. But what happens between those panels is the grammar of comics. It's the soul of comics. I define comics as sequential art. That means that, to me, it's the arrangement of the elements in comics that define them. And that arrangement is one after another. And it's what happens in that space in between, where the reader is encouraged to use their imagination to make a bridge between those images. That's where the magic of comics is. That's where the most unique aspects of comics are. That panel-to-panel gap is something that exists in no other art form. It isn't about writing, and it isn't about art. It isn't about any other art form. It's about the human imagination and our ability to take a fragmented view of reality and make it whole, make it continuous.
A great example of using the space between the panels to bridge fragmented images and to create a rhythm is the 12-issue graphic novel Watchmen. This landmark superhero story used the classic 9-panel grid that was favored in the 40s and 50s. Most modern artists find this tic-tac-toe grid too confining, and yet it was one of the greatest strengths of Watchmen. A few years back, when Nancy and I saluted the Watchmen project, I asked writer Alan Moore and artist Dave Gibbons how they approached layout. You either used a simple 9-panel grid or a variation of one. How did that very rigid structure affect the way you wrote the story?
It made it so clear and so easy and so streamlined. It was Dave's idea. Dave was harking back to Steve Ditko. Now, if you look at those very early Marvel comics, they have a large number of panels per page. 6, 9 panels. All in a very tight grid. There is none of this panels exploding beyond their borders, strangely shaped psychedelic panels, which are interesting and they're a novelty. But in the end, the shape of the panel should not be distracting from what's going on in the panel. It's the story that's happening in the panel that's important. And what we found working with that device was that, I think as Dave has mentioned in interviews, that it became eventually like the proscenium arch at a theatre. That or a television, you're looking at a television, the shape of the screen does not change, just like the shape of the proscenium arch doesn't change. And so you forget about it. You allow yourself to become totally absorbed into the imagery that's being shown within that rectangle.
Dave, I'd have thought that sticking to a simple 9-panel grid would limit you. How did you keep it interesting?
We used every trick we knew or had learned about how to tell stories in comic strip form. You know, the way you have a fixed viewpoint and a character advances towards you. The way that you keep the character constant, but you move the camera, as it were, around with him. Things like this. Things that actually had a graphic pattern to them as well, unlike a movie where it's a succession of moving images that, in fact, although they follow each other in time, compositionally speaking, they're not related to one another. On a comic page, you can make them compositionally related to one another. You can make an echo by framing a thing exactly the same as you did something earlier on, in a very controlled way, in a very obvious way, in a very deliberate way, that because you can compare the two pictures, you can stop and go back and compare, which you can't do in a movie. These resonances become very, very striking.
Also, in terms of control, it meant that I was able to lay out the pages visually and know exactly how much space I had for each image, you know, where the full page width images would fit best, you know, where you should use a run of small panels, where you should use bigger ones. I was able, more so than ever before, to have control over the visual flow of narrative, which was great for me. I think you'll see in a lot of my other work since then, I've found that grid to be very useful, and I've used it repeatedly. It just seems to me to be a much more classic and direct form of comic storytelling.
For me, the grid also suggested a rhythm, like a ticking watch. Did you find that as well?
The grid did give it a rhythm, and it also, yes, it was a rhythm. And the interesting thing about a rhythm is the rhythm becomes very conspicuous. I mean, normally in a comic book, a big picture, we're talking about 2/3 of a page or something. In a page that's broken up into 9 fragments, even 2 of those put together appears a big picture. So we found that we actually had a range, that there was with the rhythm, there were the different beats that could go within that rhythm. And again, I mean, this was a great thing for Alan, because he could orchestrate it. He could say da 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 da. If you that's a famous tune as well. But yeah, it did impose a structure, and the thing was about structure anyway. I mean, what Watchmen is about patterns and echoes and rhythms and things like this. So it all seemed to fit. It all seemed of a piece.
A few mainstream comics broke away from the strictures of the grid as early as the 60s and 70s. With Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., Jim Steranko successfully fused the drama of Eisner with the energy of Kirby to produce cigar-chomping, gun-blazing, two-fisted pyrotechnics. In Doctor Strange, artist Gene Colan stretched, shrunk, shredded, and scattered the panels across the page to create a strobing, psychedelic kaleidoscope that perfectly suited stories about the occult. And with Dead Man, the ghostly hero of Strange Adventures, Neil Adams experimented with innovative panel combinations and hidden images in the design elements. Can you spot Dead Man's face? But today's proliferation of panels of every imaginable size, shape, and circumference can be traced to the groundbreaking comic American Flag, which burst onto the scene in 1983.
For me, I was never comfortable using the grid pattern until I got old enough to see the grid pattern for what it is. But to this day, I try to imply the presence of time in narrative. And that's what layout does. I mean, Simonson and I used to stay up all hours of the day or night avoiding working and talking over enormous bowls of popcorn. And what we often discussed was the idea that comics is illustration with the element of time. And I like the idea of time as a storytelling device, the idea of simultaneity, the idea of crosscuts using inset panels to imply a rhythmic motion. I taught a course at the Learning Tree in Chatsworth in Los Angeles this past spring rather, and it was about comic book writing, but I tried to get these people to think visually and to realize that it's not just a series of pictures on paper, which, unfortunately, regardless of what I think, has become what it is. I believe that the current crop of comics that are being very popular now are generally speaking anti-literate, anti-narrative, and kind of insipidly laid out using techniques that I take full responsibility for introducing.
So how does that make you feel?
It's a lot like feeling like Van Morrison in a realm of Axl Roses. Yeah.
So why did you develop such a seemingly random visual language for American flag? I mean, people had broken away from the grid before, but you seem to be really pushing the boundaries of boundaries.
This is going to get a little clever, so bear with me. Picasso always said that he developed Cubism as a basis, as a result of watching film. That Cubism was an attempt to convey the idea of repeated imagery on canvas. And to a great extent, I no longer watch television except in the way that all men watch television, which is to say with the wand of the remote in front of me. And what happens with that is you create another language. By bleeding all of those images together, it becomes another vocabulary. And to a certain extent, American Flag was about the collapse of that narrative, with the use of overlapping imagery, with the use of repetition, with the use of the segue of dialogue from one page to another, from one scene to another without really a connection. I was assuming, and usually wrongly, that the reader was urbanly literate and media literate. And that was the main objective of that book for me, to do a book that was so completely and totally lived out on TV that the hero could take the time off and the show would go on.
Right.
And that's why. Does that help in any way with your problem, young man?
Absolutely, sir.
Page design and storytelling, they're the same, and they're both very important. You know, you can't have one without the other. Not in my work. I don't differentiate the two. Though, actually I do. See, that's not true. I will not sacrifice storytelling for design. You know? My point is to get the emotions of the characters across, or to get the emotional content of the scene across. If I do that and it fights my sense of design, but I get the point across, it's more important than making a whole pretty picture of the page. You know? I want to take the reader on a ride. I don't necessarily want to take them on a purely visual trip. It's not the thing I want you to get from reading Mouser books when I was younger. You know, that was a whole different thing, you know. I was like, wow, look at that great rendered figure that Dennis Cow did, and I'd be very happy to hear that.
Sure.
As I've gotten older and more experienced in my craft, that's changed.
Page layout continues to grow more sophisticated and varied. And someone who's done it all is writer-artist Frank Miller. In Daredevil, Frank took Will Eisner's theatrical style down the dark alleys and mean streets of the inner city. In Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, his postmodern superhero story, Frank drew to the steady 4/4 beat of a 16-panel grid. And with Sin City, Frank broke loose with a deliberately frenzied drawing style and a layout without boundaries. Starkly black and white artwork contrasts with the moral of the story, which is anything but black and white. Frank, it's Rick. I'm looking at comic book layout, and I wanted to ask you, how important is it to approach the comic book page as a unit?
I better be facing to this. Excuse me. The comic book page has an integrity of its own, and in a way it has almost a structure of its own, an act structure of its own, in that it usually ends with either a question or an answer. And it usually, and there is this thing you're taught early on in the craft that sticks with you, of having the end of the page just yank you into the next page. Also graphically, in terms of design, it has to balance. But I find that tends to do itself. That the pages just don't tend to come out badly designed. That's one of the strange things, because, you know, early in my career, that used to be something I'd have to concentrate on quite a bit. But lately, it just seems that they balance themselves as it goes.
Now, I've noticed that, especially in Sin City, you have a tendency to obliterate characters' faces and features. Why is that?
I love to, it's almost perverse. I love to work a long time on an expression and then backlight the head and give you nothing but the cheekbone. Because a lot of the art of the comics is the reader's work. And I've found that it's amazing how generous the comic book reader is and how much the eye creates within that blob of black that indicates a face. The same way that you fill the gutters between the panels. and that you complete all the information. Whether it's a color comic or black and white, the reader does an amazing amount of work, much more than a viewer of film.
But if you let the reader fill in so much, how do you make sure they fill it in with what you want? There's so many ways that they might choose to go.
That's why drawing comics involves a bit of seduction and a bit of manipulation. My intention is to have you do what I want you to do. The degree to which I succeed is by the degree of my control of my craft. But there's a certain element of it that's all yours. I mean, that's what I think makes comics so intimate. Is that you're bringing your own experiences. That mouth you can't see, or that slash that's a mouth, relates to perhaps a mouth that was on your mother or your lover or your sister or whatever. That only you bring to it.
A minute ago, you mentioned the gutters. How important are those spaces between the panels in your work?
Here's where it's really dangerous to talk about it, because it really starts sounding like Salvador Dali. But the space between panels is fascinating. I often remove images by the dozen in order because I want you to make that jump between the two, because you can create an entire scene between two panels, and you often do. And it adds to the drama when the reader is so involved that he sees that the character has lied. The most simple example would be the character saying, "I will not do that." And the next panel, he's done it. You have filled in everything in between, and you've learned something about that character. You almost created something about that character that is very exciting. Comics can do that in a way that more so than movies, where movies also obviously through cutting from one scene to another can accomplish the same thing. But with comics, you're doing that in the middle of a scene constantly. You'll notice that in a comic book, someone will offer someone a cigarette, for instance. In the next panel, they'll both be smoking the cigarette, and only 2 lines of dialogue will have been exchanged. And an entire moment of lighting and everything that might have been a cumbersome moment actually becomes something kind of delightful because you made it happen in your head.
Yeah, that's true. Thanks, Frank. Take care. As creators like Frank Miller invent new styles of comic book and tackle an ever wider range of subjects and themes, the possibilities of page layout just keep growing. Today, artists are using everything from 6-panel grids to 96-panel grids, vertical panels, overlapping images, splash pages, even double-page spreads, whatever it takes to communicate the message. But they all have one thing in common. They all begin like this, with the artist confronted by nothing but a blank white page, and the only limit is imagination. Next week on Second Nature, anti-smoking groups say cigarette ads are aimed at insecure, susceptible teenagers, but cigarette manufacturers claim that they are trying to reach insecure, susceptible people of all ages.